Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bounce Back podcast by Robert, a podcast dedicated to discussing real issues that affect our world today. Today, we would like to discuss a very, very important topic, and it relates to the Bounce Back project, which is a new project that we've adopted at our consultancy, Cibia Rufus Africa. Remember, I am Robert Onyari, consultant expert for policy, strategy, and governance. So, the Bounce Back project is a project that we've initiated that helps us to do our work and to serve our clients better by explaining and relating the issues that affect the areas of politics, business, enterprise, and other issues, socioeconomic issues that affect the world through the prism of a bounce back. And today, we are going to explain what this bounce back means. Therefore, we would like to start our podcast today by explaining a very, very iconic issue, a very iconic story that heralds a bounce back theme. Therefore, if you want to follow this podcast, you can find it at On Roberts on YouTube or at On Roberts on Spotify. So, what do we mean by bounce back? Today's bounce back story is about Netflix. You and I, most often than not, we've interacted with Netflix. Netflix is a content streaming company that helps us access millions of content in documentary form, in movie and series form, in form of entertainment. And today we want to follow the story of Netflix and find out the bounce back theme in it. That way we can be able to understand what we mean when we say we are going to relate our work with the bounce back philosophy of iconic examples that have gone through the world in time. The stories will include business, will include industry, will include politics, and will also include individual stories and military victories. So let us get right onto it. The title of our podcast today is Netflix, When Success Becomes the Real Risk. And I'm going to discuss on this podcast how Netflix was able to navigate the bounce back theme when it was being started up until moment in 5 points. And we are going to begin with the introduction by I posing a question to you, the viewer tonight. So, what if the biggest threat to a successful organization is not failure, but success itself? Think about that. Because in most business thinking, we are trained to fear failure. We are taught to fix failure, to recover from failure, to bounce back from failure. Most often than not, we find ourselves confronting failure and wanting to come out of it, and we use that as our bounce back theme. But today, in this Netflix story, we want to see how success in itself and not failure was able to demonstrate a bounce back theme for Netflix. Because Netflix did not become a global company by surviving failure, it became a global company by surviving success. And that is what this episode is all about. So, what is Netflix? We are going to begin from there, the origin and the history of Netflix, and how Netflix came into being. So, Netflix was founded in 1997 by two gentlemen called Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph in California, in the United States. At that time, the entertainment industry looked nothing like today. Blockbuster dominated. If you will remember, when we were young, during the 90s, or even before that, and up until the first decade of 2000 or the 2000s, we would go collect movies at a movie store and sign a movie out in form of a VCR tape or a DVD. And at that time, the company that dominated the movie market was Blockbuster. Blockbuster is a company that was able to give access to viewers in form of VCR tapes and DVDs, and it dominated the movie market at that time. So there were over 9,000 Blockbuster stores globally at that time. And the video rental market itself was worth around $16 billion in the US alone. So what did Netflix do to enter into this industry to be able to dominate? And that is what we are going to discuss. Netflix started as a DVD by mail company, and the idea was simple. Customers ordered DVDs online, DVDs were delivered by mail, there was no late fees, there was no physical visit. So in 1998, Netflix officially launched its service. By the early 2000s, it was growing steadily. And here is the first critical bounce back insight. So Netflix started like Blockbuster, and it was a video rental service, just like Blockbuster was. But at around that time, it had started looking and moving into the streaming service. And though it felt and it exceeded a lot of success, there was a bounce back insight in those early days. So in 1998, Netflix officially launched its stream service, and by the early 2000s, it was growing steadily. By 2005, Netflix was shipping around 1 million DVDs per day. By 2006, it had about 6.3 million subscribers and recorded its first full year of profitability, roughly $80 million in profit. So if you were inside Netflix at that time, you would say that this is a successful model, it is working, and the business is making a profit, and there's no really any need to change the model of supply and of businesses, and giving the millions of subscribers and customers and access to DVDs online for which they could access entertainment. But what happened? Basically, what happened and what Netflix did was a certain invisible shift. You will not think that it was a company that needed reinvention. You will not think that this is a company that needed scaling. After all, it was making $80 million in profit. Therefore, what changed? That brings us to section 2, or part 2 of our discussion today. This is the Bounce Back podcast by Robert, and today we discuss the Netflix bounce back theme. So, the invisible shift. Now, let us slow down and look at what most people seemed to have missed. In 2007, Netflix launched streaming. At the time, it was not the main business. It was a side feature. The library was small. About 1,000 titles initially were available for streaming. That is, by 1,000 titles, that means the 1,000 pieces or 1,000 pieces of entertainment, or 1,000 movies, or 1,000 content features were available for streaming. As compared to DVDs, which had tens of thousands of titles. So streaming at that time looked weak, unstable, incomplete. Of course, this was around the time the internet was still new and streaming was a problem, and even the internet speeds had not really evolved, and it was quite a new feature that streaming was happening. So there was a bounce back thinking that came at around this time. Because this streaming service, this streaming model was new, Netflix decided to do something. It looked into the future, and it said that the future never looked stronger than the present at the beginning. It always looked weaker. And that is why most organizations ignored it at that time. So at this stage, Netflix had a decision to make. They could continue optimizing DVDs, which were bringing in and posting a profit, or they could invest in something that they did not yet feel necessary. Remember, in 2007, like we have said, the streaming service was not strong, the internet speeds were not that good, so streaming was basically a new concept, but Netflix, as a bounce back theme, decided to go ahead with it anyway. So let us pause here. Because this was not a technology decision, it was a leadership philosophy. Most companies did not see the relevance, but Netflix began investing in what was yet not needed. That decision created internal tensions in the company. And the question that were being asked was, why change a system that was still profitable? Why risk customer satisfaction? Why introduce uncertainty? But here is the bounce back answer. If you wait for disruption to force you to change, you are already too late. Again, if you wait for disruption to force you to change, you are already too late. We've seen many examples of companies, organizations, institutions that have been killed, that have been murdered by disruption. During the dot-com bubble, when we were coming into the dot-com era, there are many companies, courier companies, technology companies, food delivery companies, transport companies that were still stuck in the old methods. In the coming days, as we discuss our bounce back themes, we will look at most of these companies and how they were disrupted by change in technology. And this is why we are saying, as a bounce back theme, Netflix decided not to get into this trap. Netflix decided to say that if you wait for disruption to force you to change, you are already too late. So that is a bounce back theme. That is a lesson for this podcast today. Remember, this is the Bounce Back podcast by Robert Onyari, and today we are talking about Netflix and its successful bounce back theme. So section 3, the strategic disruption. So we move to the most controversial phases of Netflix history. And in 2011, Netflix made a major strategic decision. It attempted to separate its DVD business and streaming business into two pricing structures. The move was poorly received, customers were confused, the brand faced backlash, the stock dropped significantly, losing more than half its value within months. When Netflix decided to divide the DVD model and the streaming model, of course, there were consequences. Consequences, in fact, that led to even the stock tanking or dipping. But what happened? They were intentionally creating separation between two futures: the old profitable system of DVDs and the emerging system of streaming. If you're a young person, a Gen Z or a Gen Alpha who's following this program, DVDs at that time were the in thing in movies. We had DVD machines in our homes or DVD systems where we could be able to play DVDs and watch our movies through DVDs. DVDs were very successful in the 2000s. The DVD system was making a lot of profit. The DVD model was really working. But the owners at Netflix got into the disruption. They failed to put their company to be inside the disruption trap. And they decided to launch a streaming service in 2007 and push it forward towards 2011 because they were seeing the old DVD system was tanking. So, because they understood something critical, that is the owners, that a company cannot move forward if it is emotionally attached to its past success. So even while DVDs were still generating revenue, Netflix kept pushing streaming forward. So it was a sort of tappering. They were tappering out of the DVD old model system and they were getting into the new streaming service. So it was like a sort of percentage. Because we have talked about a split in the model of distribution of content, they therefore were getting away from the old model of DVD distribution and getting into investing into the new online streaming that we know Netflix to be today. So Netflix kept pushing streaming forward, and this is where bounce back thinking becomes uncomfortable because it requires you to damage control before comfort becomes dependency. Again, this is where bounce back thinking becomes uncomfortable because it requires you to damage control before comfort becomes dependency. This is the same thing as saying that a seed must die before germinating. When you plant a seed, that seed has to die fast. That seed has to fail fast. That seed has to regress fast before it begins to grow. And this is what happens or happened to Netflix. And this is basically what the bounce back theme is all about. That you have to operate from a point of failure, from a point of defeat. You have to suffer loss before you begin sprouting and begin winning and begin becoming better. And this leads us to the fourth segment of our podcast today. Once again, this is the Bounce Back podcast by Robert. I'm Robert Onyari, policy, strategy, and governance expert consultant at CBI Rufus Africa. You can find us at www.cbirufus.com. You can follow this podcast at @onroberts on YouTube and at @onroberts on Spotify. Thank you very much. So, section 4, the reinvention phase of Netflix. How then did Netflix begin to win when they decided to invest in the streaming service of content, entertainment content? So by 2013, Netflix was no longer just a distribution company. It had become a content company. That year, Netflix released House of Cards. If you remember correctly, and you movie or content entertainment industries, House of Cards is one of a great iconic series, and Netflix released House of Cards, its first major original production. So this was not just a show, it was a signal that Netflix was no longer dependent on external studios, it was now a creator. From here, the transformation accelerated. Netflix invested heavily on original content, it expanded globally, and it entered over 190 countries. This is now the reinvention we are talking about. It scaled recommendation algorithms and personalization systems. Algorithms that followed what the customer wanted, and it paired the patterns to what was available in the market in form of content, and it began advertising content that was favorable and was suitable for customers that were following or were subscribing to Netflix. And over the next decade, this decade where we are in, and the most recent decade, it became one of the most dominant forces in global entertainment. Today, Netflix has over 260 million subscribers globally, an annual revenue exceeding $36 billion, and one of the most advanced data-driven content engines in the world. But here is the important part. None of this would have been possible if Netflix had protected its DVD business for too long, because protection delays evolution. Again, I want to read for you the numbers. As of today, there are over 260 million subscribers globally of Netflix, including myself and others, an annual revenue exceeding $36 billion, one of the most advanced data-driven content engines in the world. But the important part is that none of this would have been possible if Netflix had protected its DVD model for too long, because protection delays evolution. Therefore, what are we saying in this bounce back program today by Robert? What we are saying is that when you feel a bounce back, when you feel regressing, when you feel that you're failing, when you feel that you're weak, when you feel that you're losing, there's always a push, there's always a motivation to bounce back, to become better, to grow stronger. And this is what Netflix did. And this is the theme and the philosophy that we are selling at CBI Rufus. We are saying that operating from bounce back, of operating from a point of weakness, of disadvantage, you can be able to leverage on strategy, policy, and exploit governance so that you grow, you become profitable, you become stronger, and you become better. And this is what Netflix did. So in conclusion to this podcast today, we will look at section 5 and we will see where Netflix is and the lessons that this bounce back theme for Netflix is teaching us today. So the bounce back lesson for Netflix. So let us bring back the bounce back system and try to understand it. Most people define bounce back as recovering from failure, fixing what is broken, rebuilding after collapse. But Netflix shows us something different. Netflix did not bounce back from failure. It bounced back. Netflix did not bounce back from failure. Netflix did not bounce forward from success. It changed direction while still stable. It was not trapped in disruption. It disrupted itself before the world disrupted it. And that leads us to a deeper question. What systems in your life or organizations are still working but no longer evolving? Because that is where the real risk lives. Again, I will ask, what system in your life or organization are still working but not longer evolving? That is where risk lives, basically. Not in failure, but in delayed adaptation. Therefore, in conclusion to this Bounce Back podcast by Robert tonight, this Saturday, we want to close by saying, let me close with this. Most organizations do not collapse suddenly. They decline slowly while still appearing successful. And by the time they recognize the need for change, they are no longer innovating. They are reacting. The bounce back system is not about recovery, it is about redesign. Not after collapse, but before collapse, because becomes visible, success comes. So Netflix was not just a success story, it was a warning and a blueprint. And that is what we will continue to explore in the coming future. So basically what we are saying, viewers, ladies and gentlemen, that the story of Netflix challenges us to think in terms of a bounce back model, that we don't need to wait till the market feels or sees disruption. We do not need to wait till we have an extraneous variable. We do not need to wait till there's a catalyst in our experiment. No. We need to see the signs of the time, and using strategy, we need to look at how we can get disrupting before we are disrupted, how we can die before we begin to germinate. And that was what Netflix did. So in summary, it's not that Netflix was failing with the DVD model, no. In 2007, the owners of Netflix saw far ahead, and they realized that streaming was the future, and they decided to begin to invest in streaming for content vis-a-vis the DVD model. They had not failed. They were not posting losses. They were not dying, but they just said that they were tangenting, moving to some other model that was the future. And that is the theme of the bounce back. A bounce back means bouncing forward, bouncing back from what is present, and not getting trapped into a disruption. Once again, this is the Bounce Back podcast by Robert. I am your host, Robert Onyari, a policy, strategy, and governance consultant expert at cbrufus.com. You can find us on www.cbrufus.com, or you can get this podcast and listen to it, watch it at On Roberts on YouTube and at On Roberts on Spotify. Till we meet again next time with the next Bounce Back story. This is your host, Robert Onyari, and thank you for coming to this program. Once again, our theme in the coming days, months, and years is the Bounce Back Project. And the Bounce Back Project is a project that tells us about how you can leverage from weakness, from a point of disadvantage, to grow to become better, to grow to become stronger, and to not fail into the trap, not fall into the trap of disruption. Thank you very much for coming to this program on Saturday. If you have comments, if you have questions, if you have issues, you can post them on our channels, on our platforms like I've told you about. And if you want to talk to me directly, you can talk to me on 0700-631-877. Once again, you can talk to me on 0700-631-877. Thank you very much for listening to the Bounce Back podcast for today on the Netflix story. Till we meet again next Saturday, peace out.